We must congratulate Messrs. James Baines and Co. in having such a gentleman as Captain Forbes to command this clipper. If it possibly can be done, Captain Forbes will, with his gallant craft, put an end to all of the croakings about the inability of clipper ships to compete with steamers to Australia. The Liverpool Journal, September 22nd, 1855. In less than half a year from the writing of the piece, the Schomberg, in which such hopes had been placed, was a total loss. And Captain Forbes will be facing 6 counts in the Australian criminal courts for the incident.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Destructive Race of the Schomberg.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Schomberg had been built specifically for the trade between the United Kingdom and Australia, with special attention paid to passengers, since there was a large demand for ships to carry people who were moving to Australia at the time. In total, the 2,400-ton wooden clipper ship had cost her owners, the Black Ball Line, £50,000, but they intended to earn it back with her ability to hold up to 1,000 people. Special attention had been paid to her first class, and the ladies' room in particular had doors made of bird's-eye maple and glass panels, and inlaid with decorations in the shape of fruit and flowers made of pearls. Acknowledging the tedium which was offered by a voyage that generally lasted months, a piano was provided for the first-class passengers, as were a library and writing room. As was often the case, no such fine appointments were given to the second-class passengers or those who were in steerage. But it was called out that, at double the cost, the company had chosen metal-framed bunks instead of wooden ones to ensure stability. There had also been special care taken in the lighting and ventilation, and baths were provided. Considering the state of many Australian immigrant ships, these were considered unusual and luxurious indeed. There were also fire engines and lifeboats available, in case anything did go wrong. It was hoped that all of these things would attract passengers away from the American-owned vessels that were popular at the time, with people heading to Australia, many of which were steamers. While the Schomberg was powered by sail still, her giant masts and huge amount of sail she could carry, it was hoped would make her more reliable than the steam-powered ships at the time without sacrificing speed. As for Captain Forbes, it was acknowledged that he was young, and that his appointment to captain of such a new and luxurious ship might come as a surprise, but he had a good reputation. He was particularly known for having made a voyage to Australia and back to Great Britain in 5 months and 20 days, not a small achievement. Considering the goal that the Black Ball Line had in building the Schomberg was to have her make speed records, he seemed like a perfect appointment. As the Schomberg prepared for her maiden voyage, Captain Forbes told the press, "Hell or Melbourne in 60 days." Considering his story, as well as the care that had been put into the Schomberg, people did not think it was an impossible boast. The Schomberg departed Liverpool on her first voyage to Australia on the 6th of October, with her destination being Melbourne. In total, she was carrying 450 passengers. She also carried a cargo that included the materials for an iron railway bridge for the crossing at Hawthorne. From the ship's mizzen, truck flags reading 60 days to Melbourne fluttered as the ship was towed down the Mersey. Considering the speed with which it was hoped that she would complete her first voyage, Captain Forbes must have been disappointed when they met with light winds almost immediately. With the winds not in their favor, it took them 28 days to cross the equator. And, on crossing the equator, they spent 10 days practically entirely becalmed. By the 55th day of the voyage, they had traveled a distance that Captain Forbes had expected to travel in 38 days or less. For such a short time, they did finally have favorable winds, and the ship showed what she was capable of, with an average speed of 15.5 knots. But on the 22nd of December, the wind once again shifted against them. Meanwhile, twice there were incidents that alarmed the passengers, though Captain Forbes bid them to show his confidence both in his ship and in himself to be able to handle her. On one occasion, he brought his ship frighteningly close to a large iceberg, close enough that some of the passengers thought they could hear the ship grating against the ice that was under water. The second time, Captain Forbes took his ship at high speeds across the stern of another ship, carrying away her signal halyards with her peak. On both occasions, the Schomberg was unharmed, and it was shrugged off as Captain Forbes wanting to show the world what his ship was capable of, since he was not able to prove to them that she was record-breaking fast with her maiden voyage. Captain Forbes would later write that on the 25th of December, they sighted land in the form of Cape Bridgewater, but the winds were still against them, and they were forced to frequently tack the ship. All through the night, and through the next day, they battled to keep the ship on course in spite of the strong wind that was driving the ship north. Around 11 p.m. on the night of the 26th, the land was hardly visible, and the wind had stopped blowing entirely. On this point, some of the passengers on board who were familiar with the area disagreed. They said that the ship had been very near to the land when the wind had stopped. Captain Forbes tried to turn the ship about, but with no wind to aid them, they only partially turned before the ship refused to answer the helm. Worse yet, the Schomberg found herself caught in a current that Captain Forbes said was not on his chart, and it carried them with it at a speed of about 4 knots straight into a sandbank, which Captain Forbes also noted was not in his charts. The Schomberg found herself stuck to the west of Moonlight Head. They were about 400 yards from shore. The voyage had lasted 81 days instead of the hoped-for 60, and it had ended in disaster only hours away from her destination. Initially, it was hoped that if the wind was in their favor, they would be able to drive over the shallow water, since right before the wreck, the lead had shown 17 fathoms. But when she wrecked, it was on 4 fathoms. The sand held the Schomberg tightly, though, and it was soon clear that she was going to be a total wreck. With this acknowledgement, Captain Forbes ordered the ship's rockets to be fired, and that the ship's blue lights be lit. In case they were not able to summon aid, Captain Forbes began to look to the beach for a good landing spot, and ordered that the ship's boats be swung out. The passengers would say that, after the wreck, everyone was calm and orderly. The captain looked for the best way to ensure the safety of the passengers, the officers, and crew of the ship swiftly carried out by his orders. And the passengers did not panic, and instead allowed the crew of the ship to do their work. Of particular note was a man named John Miller, an architect who had been traveling as a passenger. When he discovered that they needed to look for a safe place to land boats full of passengers, in spite of how dark and potentially dangerous it was, Miller volunteered for the task. The boat set out, but on finding that the only landing places available nearby would involve saving a few, with the loss of many, Miller ordered the boat to return to the ship so that they could warn the captain of the danger. Miller had greater concerns that he also voiced. He was familiar with the area that they had wrecked in, and it was a place prone to frequent and sudden storms. He was concerned that if they did not find a way to leave the ship would be smashed to pieces by the next big storm, with all of them in it. The keel of the ship, which was still in deep water, was already starting to go to pieces. Captain Forbes did not need to worry about finding a place to land his passengers in the end. The Schomberg's signals of distress had been spotted by an outbound steamer called the Queen, with Captain Doran in command. The Queen was quickly alongside the Schomberg, and remained there until the next morning, when they were able to take the passengers off of the stranded ship and bring them to Melbourne. Once more, Miller put himself to the front, doing his best to ensure that the elderly and infirmed and the women and children were evacuated first, something that more than one passenger expressed their gratitude for, since, for a few minutes, it had seemed as though the strongest among the passengers would get first access to the boats. In this, he was joined by the ship's chief officer, Henry Cooper Keene, who also did his best to keep order. The actions of both men were considered by the passengers to be the only reason there was no loss of life during the evacuation. The Queen was also able to take the mail carried by the Schomberg, so that this too was saved. The Schomberg had 106 men as officers and members of the crew, and the Queen was not able to take all of them on board in addition to the passengers. 40 of these men, headed by the boatswain and joined by the purser, headed to shore, taking with them their sea chests and 8 casks of provisions, including porter and brandy. There, they set up camp and refused to return to the ship. An agent of the Black Ball Line, as well as an agent of Lloyd's, who the ship was insured by, both went out to see if anything could be done, but they came away disappointed. The Schomberg could not be pulled off, and 4 days after she had struck, she was destroyed by a storm, just like the one that Miller had warned of. In the meantime, there was a huge flurry of press in the papers. The Schomberg had been heavily advertised, and was a matter of great public interest. Many people had looked forward to seeing her in the Australian waters, only to have her wreck before most people could get a glimpse of her. Many people had an opinion of what should have been done to save her, and soon the papers were full of points and counterpoints, including from Captain Forbes, who wrote to defend his actions before the ship was wrecked. Also given attention by the papers was a charitable fund set up to provide for the passengers, though it was discovered that a majority of the luggage had been saved from the Schomberg before she broke apart. On January 3rd, the passengers of the Schomberg held a public meeting at the Mechanics' Institute to investigate the reason for the wreck. One of the first orders of business was put forward by a passenger by the name of Melville, who had been traveling in second class. He proposed the passing of a resolution that the conduct of some of the officers of the ship, and of Captain Forbes in particular, was ungentlemanly, discourteous, tyrannical, and grossly immoral. A friend of Captain Forbes protested that this was not fair, as Melville offered no evidence. So one by one, passengers stepped forward and voiced the things that they had noticed in Captain Forbes' behavior. The first complaint was of their provisions. They had been led to expect good provisions on the voyage, but had been disappointed, and when one of the passengers had told the captain he did not think the food was fit for a dog, the captain had allegedly told him that they were a set of dirty dogs, and that what they had was good enough. The passengers also complained that, by an act of Parliament, they were supposed to get 3 quarts of water a day, but had even on the most generous days only received 2, and sometimes the quality had been bad. Captain Forbes had also taken 2 passengers who were Irish out of their berths in the middle of the night and locked them up, saying that they were a set of rebels. Another passenger, who was traveling second class, said that he had once looked at the captain, and the captain had threatened to throw him in irons simply for this. Of particular scandal to the passengers was how Captain Forbes and the ship's surgeon had both associated with women from the second-class cabins at all hours of the day and night, and often when the women left the company of the officers, they were not dressed for public. In spite of the protest of some of the passengers who pointed out that Captain Forbes had sent food from his own table to the sickly on board the ship, and this charity showed that he thought of his passengers' well-being, the motion passed that the captain and the officers had been tyrannical and ungentlemanly. The speculation amongst some of the passengers that Captain Forbes had been so disgusted with the slow time that the ship had made that he intentionally wrecked the ship was then brought up. One passenger, a man named Mr. Williams, who was traveling second class, said that he had been in the forecastle when the ship had wrecked. He said that he had seen the land and called it out, only to have the first mate dismiss it as a cloud. He tried to voice his concern again, but he was stopped. So he instead ran to second class area and told all of his friends to put on their clothing and not go to sleep, because there was likely to be a wreck. It was concluded and resolved that the Black Ball Line had failed to fulfill their contracts with the passengers, and a representative was elected from this meeting to go and put the case to the government and try to force them into action. In this they were successful, and an inquiry was held into the actions of Captain Forbes and Mr. Saxby, the third mate, for negligence. Here the two women that Captain Forbes had been seen with once more came to the public attention, since it was alleged that the reason he had not been on deck, in spite of the difficult location the ship was sailing in, was because he was playing cards with two ladies. At the inquiry, the boatswain and Melville both alleged that the anchor was not let go until 2 hours after the ship had struck, and that the anchors had not been ready to let go, even if they had wanted to before that, since they were lashed for sea. They felt that if the anchors had been let go before the ship had struck, she might have been saved. Captain Matthews, one of the experts who had visited the wreck, disagreed. He testified that he also would not have prepared the anchors to be let go, since the ship was not headed directly towards the land at the time, and there was no reef or sandbank marked on the charts to be wary of. Evidence was also given that the boatswain had been given money by the passengers to testify against the captain. Captain Forbes and third mate Saxby were both ordered to stand trial for negligence, but they were also allowed bail while they awaited their day in court. In May 1856, the two men would stand trial, and without even hearing evidence from the defense, the judge would rule that there was not enough evidence that they had been negligent or had deliberately wrecked the ship, and the two were found not guilty. It was a heavy blow to the career of Captain Forbes all the same, and he would never work for the Black Ball Line ever again, and it was the end of his career sailing fast clipper ships. He would never again have a prestigious command. The railway bridge materials that the Schomberg had carried were lost, and it would not be until 1861 that the bridge would be built as a result of the wreck. The sand that had claimed the clipper was added to charts and carried the name of the Schomberg Reef. It was not the only thing that the Schomberg's name was added to at the height of the public's interest. A piece of sheet music was soon published bearing the name of the Schomberg Gallop. In 1858, Miller would be awarded a gold medal by the Shipwrecked Mariners' Society of Great Britain for his hard work right after the wreck. Silver medals were awarded to other passengers and the two sailors who had accompanied him in the small boat to try to find a safe landing place in the dark, though there were some who said none of the four men had done enough to deserve such a high level of praise. The finery that the Schomberg had advertised made her wreckage a great interest for salvage, and a syndicate purchased salvage rights. In 1864, two captains and a merchant, who were part of this salvage effort, as well as a crew of 3 sailors, headed to the wreck site in a lifeboat. When they left, the weather was good, but once they had gotten a distance from shore, a large and sudden wave smashed their boat to pieces. One of the captains and the merchant were not able to be saved. 5 months later, another 2 men made an attempt to salvage things from the wreck, but also did not meet with any luck, and the project was abandoned. It was claimed in an article in 1975 that a portion of the upperworks of the Schomberg had broken free and had carried across the Tasman, landing the wreckage on the west coast of New Zealand. Whether or not this is the case, nor did we find any further mention of this idea, the location of the wreck is now part of both the Underwater Shipwreck Discovery Trail and the West Coast Historic Shipwreck Trail.
For more information, please see the Auckland Southern Cross from January 22nd, 1856, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.